Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Patel, when Mr. Booker was asking you questions in his first round, you said, Senator, the grand jury testimony is available to you. I encourage you to make it public. You also later said, or previously to Mr. Booker said, get my grand jury testimony. I asked the Department of Justice to make it public. I asked the Department of Justice to make it public. Do you stand by that testimony?
If that's what I said.
So you asked the Justice Department to make your grand jury testimony public?
At the time of my appearance in the grand jury.
Yeah. And who did you ask to do that?
The lawyers.
Mr. Chairman, since the witness has said that he encourages this testimony to be public, that he in fact asked the Justice Department to make it public, I would ask you, Mr. Chairman, if you and the ranking member would be willing to write to the court acknowledging the witness has asked for this to be public, supporting it being made public. I can't imagine there's a court in the land that would say no to a bipartisan request like that.
Hey guys, welcome back. Dr. John is here. So this is what just happened, guys. 3 times the Senate formally pushed back Romney's sole guilty vote in 2020, the 57-43 bipartisan guilty verdict in 2021, and the 2026 War Powers Resolution, and 3 times Trump survived. The walls are closing in, but the constitutional threshold to remove him remains just out of reach. Before we dive any deeper, let me be completely honest with you. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. They've proven time and again that they'll spin any story to fit their narrative, burying the facts that matter most and amplifying the noise that keeps you confused. That's exactly why we built this channel, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines and understand what's actually happening in Washington, join our community. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day so you never miss a development. Just click the link in the description to sign up.
I won't tell you. Let me say something. I'm not going to take this out of your time. It's not directly answering your question, but I think it'd be significant what Richard Grinnell put on X. I testified in front of Jack Smith's grand jury, at Justice Department, and Jack Smith's prosecutor told me directly that I could not talk about my testimony or risk legal actions. Then he goes on to say that certain senators, I won't mention here, should, as those ask those lawyers why they instructed witnesses this way.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We'd welcome the chance to have Mr. Grinnell testify under oath as opposed to on X. But nevertheless, what I would ask, given that this witness has said he made the request, this witness has said he would like us to read the testimony, I would ask if you and Senator Durbin would be willing to make that request of the court.
I wouldn't answer your question without talking.
And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video. Here is what the headline is pointing at and what it is not claiming. Trump's reign has not literally ended. He is still president. The Senate acquitted him twice. The War Powers Resolution is not a removal. He is still in the Oval Office making decisions, and we are not going to pretend otherwise. But here is the thing about the word reign that is worth thinking about carefully. A reign does not just mean occupying an office. A reign implies a kind of dominion, a kind of unquestioned authority, a kind of control over the political environment around you that feels absolute. In the 3 Senate moments we are talking about today, tell you something very specific about the nature and the limits of Trump's authority inside the institution that is most important for constraining it.
Get all the background I need. Considering the conversation between you two, I couldn't make that judgment now.
Yeah, I appreciate your consideration, Mr. Chairman. And the reason why I think it's so important is let's remind ourselves what those documents were in Mar-a-Lago. According to the indictment, the classified documents Trump stored in his boxes included information regarding defense and weapons capabilities of both the United States and foreign countries, United States nuclear programs, potential vulnerabilities of the United States and its allies to military attack, and plans for possible retaliation in response to a foreign attack. So testimony that goes to the care or lack of care, the truthfulness or lack of truthfulness of Mr. Patel would be directly relevant to whether he should be confirmed as FBI director, and those records are there for the asking. No court's going to turn us down. Mr. Patel may be, I don't know, but he may be the first nominee for FBI director in history.
Because when 57 senators vote that you are guilty of incitement of insurrection, and when 4 members of your own party join the opposition to pass a resolution saying you are conducting an unauthorized war, the picture of unquestioned dominion gets harder to sustain. You can be president and you can have your reign be constrained and challenged and publicly rebuked at the same time. Those two things are not mutually exclusive, and understanding that is essential for understanding why these Senate moments matter so profoundly. Now let me walk you through the specific details of each of these moments, because the details tell the story more powerfully than any summary ever could. The first impeachment trial in February 2020 ended with an acquittal on both articles, 52 to 48 on abuse of power, 53 to 47 on obstruction of Congress. Republicans held a 53 to 47 majority, and only Mitt Romney broke ranks. He voted guilty on the abuse of power count.
Who felt it necessary to plead the fifth, to say that he wouldn't testify to a grand jury because it might incriminate him. Maybe the first nominee for FBI director ever to feel the necessity of pleading the fifth. Shouldn't we ask for that testimony when the witness himself says he would encourage it? Finally, I would just say, we need to think about where we are in this moment. We have a new president. He's fired prosecutors who investigated him. He's investigating other prosecutors, or his Department of Justice is. He's fired inspector generals who might hold him accountable. And this is just the start. And as FBI director nominee, he's chosen someone whose primary qualification, in my view, is his willingness to say yes when everyone else would say no to whatever the president wanted, to say whatever he wanted, to do whatever he wanted. That's why he is sitting here. I mean, look at the people who held that job before Mr. Patel, the stature of the people that held that job, the qualifications of the people that held that job. And how can any of us think that his background, his qualifications hold a candle to the people who went before him? How did we get here where we are defending a nominee like this, who makes songs with convicts who attack law enforcement? How did we get here?
He was the first senator in American history to vote to convict a president from his own party in an impeachment trial. That is a specific historical first that happened in 2020, and the acquittal barely came with a cost. 1 vote, 1 defection. Trump survived with the appearance of party unity mostly intact, but the crack was there, visible and documented. The second trial was fundamentally different. After January 6th, after the Capitol attack, 57 senators voted guilty. 43 voted not guilty. All 50 Democrats voted guilty, and 7 Republicans voted guilty. 7 Republicans voted to convict a Republican president for incitement of insurrection after watching a mob attack the United States Capitol. That is genuinely extraordinary by any historical standard.
And where are we going? History is littered with democracies that lost their freedoms and didn't notice it while it was happening. Let's not be one of them.
Your time's up. Before Senator Tillis ends this, I want to put in the record a letter from the parents of Kayla Mueller. Mr. Patel met them through his role in the successful operation to track and kill ISIS leader al-Baghdadi. The terrorist, I'm quoting, the terrorist group ISIS kidnapped our daughter Kayla on August 2013. Any family who has lived through such an experience will know the value of dedicated, compassionate law enforcement officials. Because we have personal experience of his dedication, we know that Kash Patel is such a person. We continue to see in him a genuinely kind, thoughtful, action-oriented man who focuses on what is true and right and just. He loves our country and our citizens and wants the best for them all. He wants the country to do the best that it can. Without objection, I'll put their letter in the record.
The most bipartisan support for convicting a president in American history, and it was still 10 votes short of the 67 needed to remove. And then McConnell voted not guilty and immediately went to the Senate floor and said Trump was practically and morally responsible for what happened. That combination is one of the most revealing moments in the entire Trump political story. An acquittal that came with a moral condemnation from the man who engineered the acquittal. The Senate said not guilty in the legal proceeding, and then the Senate Majority Leader said guilty in the moral war. The political and historical record reflects both of those statements, and that contradiction has never been fully resolved. And then June 2026, the Iran War Powers Resolution. 4 Republicans joining Democrats to pass a bipartisan measure calling for an end to the conflict unless Congress formally authorizes continued military operations. The first time a War Powers Resolution related to Trump's Iran conflict passed both chambers. And Trump called it meaningless. 3 moments, 3 challenges to his authority, 3 times he survived, but the margin is getting tighter and the words are getting harsher and the bipartisan coalition is getting larger. And that trajectory is the story we are going to break down today because it tells us where we are headed, not where we've been. Let us actually get into the details of each of these Senate moments because the specifics of each vote and each aftermath tell you something that the summary does not fully capture. Let us go through them in order. The first impeachment trial, the details of how that trial was structured and what it produced, are important context for understanding the 2 that came after. In February 2020, the Senate took up the House's impeachment of Trump on 2 articles, abuse of power related to the Ukraine call and the pressure campaign on Ukrainian President Zelensky, and obstruction of Congress related to the administration blocking witnesses and documents from the House impeachment inquiry. The trial was already unusual before the vote happened. The Senate, controlled by Republicans with McConnell as majority leader, voted to proceed without calling additional witnesses, which was itself a significant decision. A decision to not call witnesses who had direct knowledge of the events at the center of the trial is a decision to limit what the trial could establish on the record. And the Republican majority made that decision. And then the vote came. 52-48 on abuse of power, 53-47 on obstruction. Romney voting guilty on the first article. Every other Republican voted not guilty. The acquittal was clean in terms of the outcome, but the fact that it happened without witnesses, and the fact that even in those conditions one Republican broke told you something about the fragility of the unanimity. A trial conducted without calling the relevant witnesses is not a trial that exhaustively examined the facts. It is a trial that was structured to produce a specific outcome. And the Republican majority made that structure happen, and Trump survived. But the conditions of his survival were already telling a story about the limits of the protection he was getting. And then January 6th happened, and everything about the political calculus around Trump changed in the immediate aftermath. In the hours and days after the attack on the Capitol, there were genuine conversations at senior Republican levels about whether Trump had to go, whether the 25th Amendment should be invoked, whether a second impeachment proceeding moving with extraordinary speed could produce a different outcome than the first. McConnell was reported to be open to conviction in the weeks immediately following January 6th. Some Republican senators who had voted to acquit in 2020 were now saying publicly that they were open to conviction. The political environment had genuinely shifted in the immediate aftermath of the attack. And then the second impeachment trial happened, and the vote was 57-43. 7 Republicans voted to convict. That number 7 represents the most bipartisan guilty vote for a president in American history. In absolute terms, a majority of the Senate said Trump was guilty of incitement of insurrection, 57 out of 100 senators, and it was not enough because the constitutional threshold for removal is 2/3, 67 votes. The 7 Republicans who voted guilty added to 50 Democrats gave you 57, 10 short of the threshold. This is while a majority of the United States Senate said you are guilty of inciting an insurrection, and it was not enough. The constitutional design of the impeachment process requires a supermajority precisely to make removal very hard. And that threshold protected Trump even when a majority of the institution said he was guilty. And then McConnell's floor speech, which may be the most remarkable single statement by a Senate Majority Leader in modern political history. McConnell voted not guilty, and then he went to the Senate floor and said Trump was practically and morally responsible for provoking the January 6th mob. He said Trump's conduct in the weeks between the election and January 6th was a disgraceful dereliction of duty. He said Trump had fed lies to his followers for weeks, suggesting the election had been stolen and had incited the attack through his own statements. statements. He said practically and morally responsible. And he said those things immediately after voting not guilty. The reason he voted not guilty while saying all of that, his stated rationale, was that he believed the Senate did not have jurisdiction to try a president who had already left office by the time the trial happened. That was the procedural argument. But the substance of what he said about Trump's conduct was as damning as anything any senator said who voted guilty. The Republican majority leader said the president was practically and morally responsible for an insurrection and still voted to acquit him. That combination is genuinely extraordinary. And it tells you something very specific about the limits of what the Senate was willing to do even when its own leaders believed Trump was morally culpable. And now let us look at the June 2026 Iran war powers vote, because this one is different from the impeachment votes in a very important way. It is not about past conduct. It is about current ongoing presidential action. The Iran war has been running for months. The cost is documented at between 25 and 29 billion in its first 2 months. The administration has been defending its war-making authority under an interpretation of the War Powers Resolution that senators on both sides of the aisle have called legally invented. And in June 2026, 4 Republicans joined the Democratic caucus to pass a War Powers Resolution calling for the war to be halted unless Congress formally authorizes continued military action. 4 Republicans. Those 4 Republican senators looked at the Iran war, looked at their obligations under the Constitution and the War Powers Resolution, looked at the political environment they are operating in, and decided that voting with the Democrats on this specific question was something they were willing to do. In a 51-49 Senate majority, 4 Republican defections on anything is a massive political event. And Trump called it meaningless, which is what presidents say when a congressional rebuke is not something they can ignore, but do not want to acknowledge the significance of. The War Powers Resolution does not by itself force troop withdrawals. It does not by itself end the military operation, but it is a formal bipartisan congressional statement that the president's war-making authority on this specific conflict has been challenged and rebuked by the institution that the Constitution designates as the body with the power to declare war. And there was a closed-door confrontation between Trump and Senate Republicans that preceded the vote. Senators bluntly told him in that closed-door setting that Congress must play a bigger role in decisions about prolonged military engagements. They were not delivering that message diplomatically. They were telling him directly in private that his approach to the Iran conflict was creating political and constitutional problems that the Senate was no longer willing to absorb silently. And then the vote happened, and 4 of them put their name on the record alongside Democrats. That is the most significant expression of intra-party Senate dissent in Trump's second term so far. And it happened over the most consequential ongoing policy decision of the second term, the Iran war. And here is what ties all 3 of these Senate moments together into a coherent picture. Each one represents the Senate institution formally asserting a check on Trump's authority in a moment where that check was genuinely contested and politically costly for the members who participated in it. Romney voting guilty in 2020 was politically costly for him in his state and in his party. The 7 Republicans who voted to convict in 2021 all faced political consequences in their home states and with the national MAGA base. The 4 Republicans who voted for the Iran War Powers Resolution in June 2026 are all going to face questions about that vote from their primary constituents and from the Trump political operation. Each of these defections was not free. It carried political costs, and the people who made them anyway. That tells you something very specific about the calculation those senators were making. They were deciding that the constitutional and moral stakes of the question before them were high enough to absorb the political cost of defecting. And 3 times now, that calculation has produced visible, documented, on-the-record challenges to Trump's authority in the institution most important for constraining it. And let us look at something important about the closed-door confrontation between Trump and Senate Republicans before the Iran war powers vote, because the details of what happened in that meeting, as reported by people who were present, reveal something very specific about the nature of the relationship between Trump and his Senate caucus right now. Senators went into that meeting and told Trump directly, bluntly, that Congress must play a bigger role in decisions about prolonged military engagements. That is not a polite suggestion. That is not diplomatic language. That is sitting down with the President of the United States and telling him to his face that what he is doing with the Iran war exceeds the authority congressional Republicans are willing to cover for him on. And then the senators went back to the floor and voted, and 4 of them voted for the resolution. Now that means most of the Republican caucus stayed with Trump on the vote. But the senators who voted for the resolution did so after being in that room, after hearing Trump's argument, after having the direct private conversation, and they voted against his position anyway. The senators who voted for the resolution were not acting on incomplete information or without having heard the administration's case. They heard it in private directly, and they still voted the other way. That is a very specific and very significant kind of defection. It is not defection from ignorance or miscommunication. It is defection after full information and direct private engagement. And that tells you that the 4 Republican senators who voted for the Iran resolution did not think Trump's case for war's legal authorization was convincing enough to justify their continued support on the vote. That is a substantive policy judgment made after a private briefing that went against the president's explicitly stated position. And let us look at the specific numbers around what it would take for future Senate votes to produce different outcomes. In the current 51-49 Senate, Democrats need 6 Republican votes to reach majority support on a resolution. They had 4 in June 2026 for the Iran war powers question. They need 2 more. And in the Senate, where 3 Republicans already voted against the big beautiful bill and 4 voted for the Iran war resolution, the threshold for majority bipartisan action is not as distant as it might appear. 6 Republican votes for a future war powers or accountability measure is a realistic threshold that depends on approximately 2 more senators deciding the political cost of defection is worth it. And the conditions that could make 2 more senators reach that decision, falling approval numbers, escalating war costs, economic consequences, midterm pressure, are all present and building right now. And let us look at what McConnell's post-acquittal floor speech in 2021 actually did to the political meaning of the second impeachment trial. The combination of 57 guilty votes and McConnell's speech produced something a simple acquittal could not produce by itself. A formal, on-the-record public condemnation of Trump's January 6th conduct by the most powerful Republican in the Senate, delivered immediately after that same senator voted to let Trump escape removal. The speech said Trump was practically and morally responsible. It said Trump's conduct was a disgraceful dereliction of duty. It said Trump fed lies to his followers for weeks. And it was said by McConnell, not by a Democratic opponent, by the Republican Senate Majority Leader who had just engineered Trump's acquittal on a procedural ground. And what it established in the most authoritative Republican voice available at that moment is that the acquittal was not an exoneration. It was a procedural outcome. And the moral verdict, according to the man who produced a procedural acquittal, was that Trump was responsible for what happened. Every future conversation about January 6th accountability happens in the shadow of McConnell's words. All right, let me lay out the core takeaways from this entire pattern, because this is what the full picture of Senate votes tells us about Trump's reign and where it actually stands. First, 2 impeachment acquittals do not mean 2 vindications. The political and historical record of both trials makes that clear. In 2020, the acquittal came in a trial conducted without calling relevant witnesses. The structure of that trial was designed by the Republican majority to produce an acquittal, and it produced an acquittal. But the fact that the majority had to engineer a witnessless trial to produce it tells you something about the confidence they had in the outcome if the evidence was fully aired. In 2021, the acquittal came after a majority of senators said guilty, 57 to 43 guilty. And then McConnell stood on the Senate floor and said Trump was practically and morally responsible for an insurrection. The acquittal was a procedural outcome based on a jurisdictional argument. The moral verdict stated publicly by the Senate's own Republican leader was something very different. When your own party's Senate leader says you are practically and morally responsible for inciting an insurrection immediately after voting to acquit you, the acquittal is not a clean bill of health. It is a procedural survival that came with a moral indictment from the people who engineered the survival. Second, the Iran war powers vote is the most significant single Senate action of Trump's second term in terms of what it tells us about the current state of his intra-party authority. 4 Republican senators voted with Democrats to formally rebuke Trump's war-making authority. In a 51-49 Senate, where every Republican vote matters enormously, where the big beautiful bill passed by a single tie-breaking vote from the vice president, where 3 Republicans already voted against that signature legislation, in that context, 4 Republicans voting for an Iran war powers rebuke is a genuinely significant political event. It tells you that the intra-party solidarity that Trump has been depending on to protect his legislative and policy agenda is not holding on the war. The senators who voted for the resolution did so after a closed-door confrontation where senators told Trump directly that Congress needs a bigger role in decisions about prolonged military engagements. They heard his arguments, they had the private conversation, and then they voted against his position anyway. That is not a small thing in the political environment of Trump's second term. Third, the trajectory of the 3 Senate moments is toward more willingness to push back, not less. And that trajectory matters for understanding where things are headed. In 2020, 1 Republican broke. In 2021, 7 Republicans voted to convict, the most bipartisan guilty vote for a president in history. In 2026, 4 Republicans joined Democrats on the Iran war powers question. Each successive Senate challenge to Trump's authority has produced a larger or more significant bipartisan coalition than the one before. And the political conditions driving that trajectory, falling approval, rising war costs, economic consequences felt by voters, coalition fractures in the Senate have not reversed. They have continued to develop. The trajectory tells you more than any single vote does. 1 defection, 7 defections, 4 defections on a different dimension. The direction of movement in the Senate's relationship with Trump is documented. It is moving toward more bipartisan willingness to push back, not less. And the upcoming midterms are the event that will determine how much further that movement goes when the composition of the Senate changes. And here's what comes next that ties everything together. If the midterms shift the Senate composition toward Democrats or produce a more evenly divided chamber, the dynamics around future challenges to Trump's authority change significantly. A Senate with a smaller Republican majority or no Republican majority at all has more structural capacity to sustain the kind of bipartisan coalitions that produced the Iran war powers vote. The political precedents set by the 7 who voted to convict in 2021 and the 4 who voted for the War Powers Resolution in 2026 are precedents that future senators can point to when they are calculating whether a similar vote is survivable. Each defection makes the next defection slightly less career-ending. And in a political environment where Trump's approval is below 40% and the economic and military consequences of his second-term decisions are visible and felt by voters, the political cost of defection keeps declining. The Senate has pushed back on Trump 3 times in ways that were historically significant. The margin of the pushback has been increasing, and the conditions that drive the pushback are not diminishing. So let me leave you with this. Trump's reign is not over. He is still president. He survived both impeachments. He called the war powers vote meaningless. But the Senate has said practically and morally responsible. It has said 57 guilty. It has taken 4 Republican votes on the war. And each of those moments is on the permanent record. The reign continues, but it is constrained in ways that are documented and building. And when that building reaches its next peak, the most shocking Senate session yet may be the one that is still ahead. The walls are closing in, the coalition is fracturing, and the historical record is being written with each passing vote. Stay tuned because this story is far from over, and the next chapter is going to be the most critical one yet.